In the long history of American political aphorisms, my personal favorite has always been, "Only Nixon could go to China," a statement which references President Nixon's 1972 meeting with Mao Zedong and his decision to abandon Taiwan's claim to sovereignty over mainland China and recognize the Communist Party as legitimate. This was a seismic turn in geopolitics, and the statement was coined to express that only someone with anti-communist bona fides as strong as Nixon's could have recognized Mao's government without paying a steep political price for it. In the years since, it has been applied to other situations, such as Democratic President Bill Clinton's decision to gut welfare in 1996, where a leader takes a controversial stance that builds support among a new constituency, but is seemingly at odds with their own ideological inclinations. These politicians can only hope that decades of building credibility on these issues prevents any damaging political repercussions. It's a strategy with significant risks built in, but if a politician can successfully thread the needle, then they can emerge with a wider support base. Naturally, Nixon wasn't the first to try it, and we should not be surprised that in the long, convoluted, and oftentimes Machiavellian politics of the Roman Republic, we are presented with many examples of this principle in action. Perhaps the ideal Roman formulation of the phrase would be, "Only a Gracchi can support land reform." The Gracchi brothers were of course members of one of Rome's most storied old families, yet they took up the cause of the landless plebeians with unmatched zeal, and famously paid the ultimate price for it. Given their proud lineage, the staunch popular turn of the eldest brother, Tiberius Gracchus, must have come as a shock to his peers in the Roman nobility, and though our sources provide some insight into his decision to take up the populare banner, questions remain about the true scope of his goals, and his controversial legacy remains shaped by the tension between hostile sources and laudatory popular traditions. At the popular level, the modern consensus is that Tiberius was a radical, someone committed to the fundamental transformation of the Roman state and the empowering of its plebeian masses to an unprecedented level. Those who view the popular cause with respect, and those with disdain for the people seem aligned on this view of Tiberius, even if they would agree on little else. But when we analyze Tiberius Gracchus's political approach and the social context of his demands, a startlingly different picture emerges. Tiberius was not a fire-breathing radical seeking to remake the Roman state, but rather a modest reformer who was fully committed to the fundamental precepts of the Roman Republic. In fact, it can be argued that it was his refusal to embrace a more radical path that ultimately led to his downfall and the massacre of the Populare movement that followed. The case for Tiberius as a radical is a rather well-tread one, so I won't spend too much time outlining its finer points here. But the view rests on his decision to take up the popular cause at all, when by all accounts a more conventional path to political prominence was available to him through a combination of his aristocratic connections and innate talents. Furthermore, in seeking to redistribute land, Tiberius was striking at the very heart of the Roman elite. We must remember that prior to the emergence of complex money economies, wealth was primarily reckoned in how much land one owned. In this context, his call for land redistribution would be akin to a modern politician calling for the New York Stock Exchange to be collectivized. The final piece of evidence, and the one that I feel is most critical to the case for Tiberius as a radical, is that late in his tribunate, he began to openly flout precedent. First, in his move to depose an opposing tribune, and second, in standing for the office despite the legally dubious nature of his candidacy. Surely, the argument goes, these actions, or some combination of them, testify to someone who aimed to rip up the Roman state at its very roots and remake it into something more populist. Perhaps this is the case, though I'm inclined to take a much more conventional view of his political ambitions. For when analyzing and categorizing the elder Gracchus's political career, we must remember that the image of Tiberius as a radical has its origins in the propaganda of his enemies. From early on in his tribunate, the conservative elite painted him as a threat to the Republic itself, claiming that he was only allying himself with the masses in order to gain their support so he could crown himself king. Tiberius, in contrast, always maintained that he was a politician acting firmly within the Republican mold. We can, of course, suspect him of downplaying his true aims, but given the integrity of Tiberius and the repulsive character of his opponents, I'm much more inclined to give him the benefit of the doubt here and take him at his word. Ironically, it is those of a modern left-wing persuasion, on the hunt for heroes in the ancient past, who are most inclined to believe Gracchus was the man depicted in the propaganda of elite aristocrats, and not the man he claimed to be. For until the very end of his career, there was nothing inherently radical about Tiberius's agenda, or even his tactics. Not only were his proposals rather moderate in the final reckoning, he sought to achieve his ends through means that were well within Republican constitutional norms. The office of the tribunate had always wielded enormous power within the Roman constitutional system. Tiberius was simply the first to realize what the tribunate was capable of, and employ the magistracy to achieve his desired reforms. Though his ultimate aims can be debated by scholars, the origins of Tiberius's popular opinions seem clear enough. Plutarch details that while traveling to Spain to serve as quaestor in 137, he became troubled by the lack of free Roman smallholders. As Tiberius was passing through Tuscany on his way to Numantia, he observed the dearth of inhabitants in the country, and those who tilled its soil or tended its flocks there were barbarian slaves. He then first conceived the public policy, which was the cause of countless ills to the two brothers. Though the decline in free citizen farmers was troubling enough in its own right, Tiberius also understood that it was these landowners who formed the backbone of the legions. If Rome was unable to enlist the soldiers it needed for the wars, occupations, and pacification operations that were becoming a permanent fixture of Republican politics, then further expansion was untenable. After his year as quaestor, Tiberius waited for several years in Rome before declaring his candidacy for tribune of the plebs. Despite his family's fame and fortune, he seems to have been damaged goods at this time, due to his personal conflicts with the Senate over their refusal to ratify a treaty he had negotiated in Numantia. Tiberius was shamed by the Senate for providing terms that were seen as too generous to the tribes, and in the context of Roman politics, he would have taken their refusal to codify his agreement as a slap in the face and an insult to his honor as a Roman. But in 133 he deemed that the time was right to resume his political career. From the start, his campaign seems to have been fueled by populist fervor, as Tiberius confidently broke ranks with many of his fellow aristocrats and courted the support of the masses. Cicero tells us that he took the office because he was so infuriated with the nobility. Campaigning in opposition to Rome's oligarchs was ironically only possible because of the immense wealth of his family and the prestige of his name, as well as the clientship obligations he had accumulated as a powerful aristocrat. He was supported by prominent senators and even ex-consuls, but we don't know if this was because they also saw the need for reform or due to the complex system of favors that defined Roman politics. But still, a turncoat is a turncoat, and the masses love a good class traitor, especially one that is ideologically committed to their cause. The energy and ambition of Tiberius were most of all kindled by the people themselves, who posted writings on porticos, house walls, and monuments, calling upon him to recover for their poor the public land. Tiberius rode a wave of popular support into the tribunate with a clear mandate for reform. Everyone knew that this is what he was campaigning on, and that he intended to harness the incredible power of the tribunate to deliver change that the Roman people had been demanding for years. This was made clear in his brilliant speeches that even Cicero, who was a committed ideological opponent, praised as splendid. Whenever, with the people crowding around the rostra, he took his stand there and pleaded for the poor, "The wild beasts that roam over Italy," he would say, "have every one of them a cave or lair to lurk in, but the men who fight and die for Italy enjoy the common air and light, indeed, but nothing else. Houseless and homeless, they wander about with their wives and children, and it is with lying lips that their imperators extort the soldiers in their battles to defend sepulchres and shrines from the enemy, for not a man of them has an hereditary altar. Not one of all these many Romans an ancestral tomb, but they fight and die to support others in wealth and luxury. And though they are styled masters of the world, they have not a single clod of earth that is their own. But despite this radical language, the proposed reforms were actually quite moderate and were drafted with input from a cross-section of leading aristocrats. For instead of seizing all farmland and redistributing it evenly among all Roman citizens, Tiberius only sought to enforce existing limitations on the amount of public land that could be owned by any individual. In fact, his laws were specifically drawn up with the purpose of enforcing existing laws that were already on the books, but were being ignored by the corrupt Roman elite. Passing laws to demand that existing laws are enforced is not the calling card of a revolutionary. Rather, it is indicative of someone that is invested in protecting the legitimacy of the current governmental structure. But not only did Tiberius's reforms not touch the vast private estates of the wealthy, they even accommodated those that had illegally taken charge of public land by increasing the legal maximum allotment from 500 aegura, or roughly 300 acres, to up to 1,000 aegura if they had 2 sons. Tiberius was so conciliatory that he was prepared to effectively double the legal public land claims of wealthy landowners, but still they fought him tooth and nail. This demonstrates that the public land claims of the oligarchs who dominated the Senate were far, far in excess of not just the legal maximum, but of Tiberius's extension. If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing. We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm to notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support. These efforts at moderation won Tiberius no support from the conservative diehards, and despite overwhelming popular backing for the bill, it was DOA in the Senate. Reading the writing on the wall, Tiberius initially took the bill directly to the plebeian assemblies, declining to even give the Senate an opportunity to voice its opinion on the matter. The elite were incensed by this breach of protocol, which, though entirely constitutional, violated centuries of precedent. In response, they worked with another tribune named Octavius, who was himself an owner of public land. Octavius vetoed the vote by the assembly and so prevented the passage of the bill. His position here is a reminder that despite the radical origins of the tribunate, the magistracy was typically held by elites with little interest in the material well-being of the poorest plebeians. But despite his aristocratic leanings and the long-standing hesitance of most tribunes to advocate for any meaningful change, Octavius's decision to veto the will of the people was unprecedented and a severe breach of faith. The tribunician veto was intended to protect the people from abuse by the elite, not to be used against the very electoral body that selected the tribunes and was recognized as the authoritative voice of popular sentiment. Tiberius attempted reasoning with Octavius, but it is difficult for a man to see logic when his pocketbook is on the line, and he refused to yield. In response, Tiberius proposed an unusual solution, that the plebeians vote on whether or not Octavius should be deposed from office. When, however, Octavius was not to be persuaded, Tiberius introduced a law depriving him of his tribuneship, and summoned the citizens to cast their votes upon it at once. Now there were 35 tribes, and when 17 of them had cast their votes, and the addition of one more would make it necessary for Octavius to become a private citizen, Tiberius called a halt in the voting, and again entreated Octavius, embracing him and kissing him in the sight of the people, and fervently begging him not to allow himself to be dishonored, and not to attach to a friend responsibility for a measure so grievous and severe. On hearing these entreaties, we are told Octavius was not altogether untouched or unmoved. His eyes filled with tears, and he stood silent for a long time. But when he turned his gaze toward the men of wealth and substance who were standing in a body together, his awe of them, as it would seem, and his fear of ill repute among them, led him to take every risk with boldness and bid Tiberius do what he pleased. And so the law was passed, and Tiberius ordered one of his freedmen to drag Octavius from the rostra. This was Tiberius's first step into something truly radical, the idea that tribunes served at the pleasure of the people, and not as disinterested aristocrats who could pad their resume with a stint as tribune before moving on to another office. He was formulating a theory of governance and popular sovereignty that was new in Rome. It was likely this conviction that the people should determine who served as tribune that pushed Tiberius to violate conventional norms and run for a second term. Opponents tarred him with charges of aiming at monarchy, but Tiberius felt that the people alone, and not the inherently conservative traditions of the state, should decide who was elected as tribune. As far as we know, he was the first in Rome to express the idea that it was the people who were sovereign, and that Rome was comprised of its citizens, not the aristocrats who dominated its institutions. When the bill passed, and the Senate retaliated by refusing to fund the commission that was to reapportion public land, Tiberius employed this same line of argument to lay claim to the revenue of Pergamum, which its heirless king had left in his will to the Populus Romanus. Previously, this income would have been recognized as falling to the Senate, but Tiberius read the will literally. After all, who were the Populus Romanus, if not the plebeians themselves? Tiberius therefore became the first Roman to ask an important question about how a state is formed and who it should represent. His ideas about popular sovereignty remained a treacherous fault line for the remainder of the Roman Republic, and even now, political debates in modern democracies still center at their very heart on the issue of who really ought to rule. All of this occurred because a Roman aristocrat began to take his own arguments to their logical conclusion, shaped by his experience as an advocate for the masses and as an opponent of a corrupt and uncaring elite that refused to see the necessity of reform. This uncovering of fundamental contradictions at the heart of the Roman state makes Tiberius one of the most compelling figures in Roman history, but we must not overstate his populist convictions. At least initially, the program of land redistribution was framed as a necessity to make more free citizens eligible for the legions. He wanted more legionaries so that Rome would be better equipped to conquer abroad, stealing treasure and people alike from the wider Mediterranean world to enrich themselves. Tiberius may have come to see the shared humanity and dignity of all Roman citizens, but he didn't recognize non-Romans as worthy of this same basic respect. He was, at his heart, still an imperialist, and he wanted to create a more efficient Roman war machine to project Roman power abroad while exploiting those outside the protections of Roman citizenship and society. Furthermore, while he objected to foreign slaves working the vast latifundia of the rich and taking the jobs of free Romans, he had no issue with slavery as a practice. It may be hard to condemn him specifically for this, as it was a sin shared by all his fellow countrymen, but it is frustrating to see someone in the ancient world come so close to recognizing the ills of slavery, but be unable to take the logical next step and understand the inherent wickedness of the entire institution. We can, of course, simply call him a man of his time in these respects, for that is what he was, but applying this label in his defense also necessarily detracts from any efforts to paint him as an innovator in the field of human rights. Simply put, Tiberius made his radical breakthrough far too late, and was far too limited in how he applied his convictions to save his political project and even his own life. But though Tiberius's story ends in tragedy, his land reform law was maintained even after his death. Furthermore, his victories and his setbacks would point the way for other populare reformers to fight for improvements in the lives of the poorest Romans. He may have begun as a simple reformist, but the questions that he asked, the contradictions that he introduced, and the legacy that he left would ripple through time to provoke revolutions. So, given that he renounced his place in the inner aristocracy to selflessly take up the cause of others, and was even martyred for his unflinching advocacy, I think Tiberius has earned our respect, and we ought not remember him for his shortcomings, but for the profound good that he did for Rome, and that his legacy still inspires to this very day.
Eve to me is basically freedom. It's a giant open universe where you can do whatever you want. You can have really relaxed.
Those who study the ancient past often bemoan the fact that 99% of classical literature has been lost. Whether through purposeful destruction or just disappearing through the centuries, we unfortunately possess only a fraction of the great literary works of Greece and Rome. However, those that have survived remain some of the most influential texts ever written, and it's impossible not to wonder how lost literature and philosophy could not just affect our understanding of the ancient world, but may have altered the development of Western culture itself, had they survived. Countless texts exist today only as fragments or as quotes that were preserved in other literary works. But the relatively recent discovery of the wonderfully preserved Dead Sea Scrolls 80 years ago, and the innovative project employing AI to read the charred scrolls from the Villa of the Papyri in Herculaneum, fill classicists with hope that we may yet recover some of the wisdom which was lost millennia ago. Everyone has their own favorite text that they hope to see rediscovered, be it Varro's masterwork on the history of Roman religion, the legendary Sibylline oracles, or the lost works of the Greek poet Sappho. But there is one piece of literature that I would choose to recover above all of them if given the chance. It's not at the top of any classicist's list, but it is one that I feel would have the most significant impact on the modern world were it discovered in a cave somewhere, or in a neglected monastery library. I hope to one day read the Anti-Cato, a polemical tract written by Caesar that sought to dispel the overly laudatory myths that were already forming around the staunch conservative in the years following his suicide. Our limited knowledge of the work tells us that it was designed to knock Cato down a peg and highlight the unsavory aspects of his character that made him the great enemy of Caesar and the popular faction. In my ideal world, this would be required reading for anyone who takes the absurd pro-oligarchic propaganda of Plutarch's Life of Cato at face value. Caesar's elegant Latin prose made his commentaries on the Gallic War an essential text for anyone interested in Roman history, and I would love to read what his caustic pen had to say about Cato the Younger, a true villain of Roman history who is unfortunately much revered down to the present. But alas, we will probably never get that chance. Unlike works of outdated astronomy or unscientific medical treatises, the Anti-Cato could actually change the world because we are still haunted by Cato's ghost. A cult has sprung up around one of the least sympathetic Romans that ever existed, and his name is spoken of in reverential terms wherever the wealthy bemoan democracy, equality, and basic human decency. The modern idea of Cato as a principled politician who is dedicated to freedom and liberty bears little resemblance to the truth, and has largely been shaped by those who agree with his pro-oligarchic vision of a society where the rich and powerful govern with little input, much less accountability to the masses. But fortunately, we don't need Caesar's Anti-Cato to demystify this enemy of the people and paint him as he truly was. There is an abundance of surviving evidence that highlights how his venal cruelty and petty approach to politics ultimately led to the collapse of the very Senate he claimed he was trying to save. Few men had a greater hand in the fall of the Republic and creation of the Principate regime than this supposed man of principle. For Cato was no principled actor concerned with enlightened notions such as liberty and freedom. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something. But before we begin, an important note on definitions. Cato's modern acolytes praise his commitment to the Roman res publica, typically rendered in English as the Republic. But this is a misnomer, as today, republic denotes a state where all citizens have a hand in electing representatives, and all in the society can truly be said to belong to the republic in which they are citizens. In contrast, Cato was never an advocate for anything resembling this. He was instead a consistent voice in favor of greater power and influence for the Roman Senate. His defenders rely on our familiarity with senates of many modern republics to conflate the Roman Senate with the republic itself. This is highly anachronistic, as the Senate was just one component of the republic, and more power for this body necessarily meant that other branches of the Roman state would be weakened. It is also crucial to remember that when discussed in the abstract, the Senate should never be intrinsically viewed as having the best interests of the Roman people at its heart. Often, the Senate's priorities were diametrically opposed to the larger mass of Romans and skewed towards the wealthy aristocrats that composed it. With this in mind, it is easy to see how Cato's preference for a strong Senate was not arrived at from a principled analysis of Roman law and precedent, but rather a purely material one. Cato was a wealthy aristocrat, and he wanted to become an even wealthier aristocrat. He knew the chances of this became exponentially more likely with each lever of power that the Roman oligarchs controlled, and so he worked to heighten the control that this class exercised on every facet of Roman life. Cato is today revered as a champion of tradition, law, and liberty, but as we will discuss later, he was willing to contravene all of these, and even the Senate itself, if it meant more power for him